Well, hello, Bill.
Hi, Linda. How are you?
Well, I'm living in a surreal time, and so are you. Um, so this week we thought we'd look at the tariffs and fun with numbers. And then I want to look at the whole situation with Governor Newsom and irony. And then we'll just have a final segment where we pick up on some issues we've been following.
Great. This week, the Congressional Budget Office released a study which indicated, under a certain set of assumptions, that the tariffs would raise over $3 trillion in revenue. So Trump was crowing and preening and declaring his tariff policies a success. He pointed to this study that if the tariffs continued in their current form without revision, would raise over $3 trillion, which is revenue for the federal government. He noted that this meant his policies covered the cost of the big bad bill. Of course, Trump, the believer that numbers are made up to support or undermine his personal demented view of reality, did not examine the assumptions underlying the projections.
Oh, well, now that surprises the hell out of me.
Yeah. So I wanted to see what, the usual budget hawks had to say about this. And according to the Committee for a Responsible Budget, which did examine the assumptions underlying the scenarios used by the Congressional Budget Office, they concluded that the projection of revenues from tariffs do not, under any scenario, offset the cost of the big bad bill's tax cuts for people who don't need them. This conservative research group wrote, and I'm going to read this. Yesterday, the Congressional Budget Office estimated that recent tariff policies would reduce deficits by $2.5 to $3 trillion through 2035, leading some to conclude that the tariffs could pay for the $3 trillion of borrowing under the House-passed reconciliation bill, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. But when measured on a comparable basis and incorporating the recent court ruling, the tariffs would cover as little as 1/6 of the big bad bill's cost. Assuming the recent trade court decision ruling, many of the tariffs are illegal. And assuming this is upheld, the remaining tariffs would raise $80 billion in 2027, while the big bad bill would increase primary deficits by $540 billion. Over a decade, those tariffs would reduce debt by $8.5 billion, while the big bad bill would increase debt by $3 trillion as written and $5 trillion if extended. If the trade court's decision is overturned, the tariffs could cover about half of the big bad bill's near-term or permanent costs. These estimates assume that the tariffs are not reversed or adjusted, and no exemptions are added by the current administration or future ones.
Just to help our listener understand the implications of this, you mentioned the Committee for a Responsible Budget. Who are they?
This is a nonpartisan research group, but its purpose is set up to look at and examine policies and their impacts on the federal budget deficit, and national debt. And they are against running deficits and raising national debt. So it's a pretty conservative fiscal group that does research. Ordinarily, these would be the kinds of groups that the Republicans would point to affirm their policies. And what they have done, because they actually do statistical analysis, real statistical analysis, they have come to the conclusion that this is a fantasy, that these tariff revenues are not going to be anywhere near enough to pay for the big bad bill.
Well, we're talking about the Congressional Budget Office. Aren't they usually reliable?
Oh, there's nothing wrong with their study. It's the interpretation of the study that's important. In other words, the Congressional Budget Office is a research arm of Congress. And then Congress comes and asks them questions, and they write reports to answer the questions, or they have standard reports they write. So basically, they were asked to do revenue predictions of the consequences of the tariffs as the tariffs were put in place over the next 10 years under the assumption that nothing would change. We call this ceteris paribus in economics. Everything else is held equal. You can do that, but you always acknowledge that it is not the case that everything else is going to stay the same.
I just love it when you talk Latin. So, what else do we need to know about this?
Well, their report goes on, the Senate Committee for Responsible Budget. They note that Congress must enact policy to count this revenue as an offset. They cannot count administrative policy changes. And the big bad bill does not include any major increase in or codification of tariffs. We'll come back to this issue later. Moreover, the savings from tariffs currently in effect, including those ruled illegal, would fall well short of the big bad bill on an annual basis. Incorporating that court ruling, the tariffs will only make up for a much smaller portion of the big bad bill cost. Now, as I mentioned, the Congressional Budget Office is really good at what it does. So Philip Swagel, the director of the CBO, is, well, again, a nonpartisan agency that sits within the legislative branch of government, noted that the CBO analysis does not account for the impact of the tariffs on the size of economy. He notes economists expect the levies to be a drag on growth. That's a nice euphemism for saying causing a recession. Swagel also cautioned that the estimates were subject to significant uncertainty, citing questions about timing, possible exceptions, and a lack of precedence. Now, for you, our loyal listener, it is important to remember that we better hope the tariff revenues are lower than projected by the CBO, because these tariff revenues are the higher prices paid by U.S. consumers for things they need, the higher prices and reduced margins if they absorb the cost of tariffs for businesses, for both inputs and finished goods, and to some degree foreign businesses, but certainly not proportionally for the folks who got the big tax cut. Of course, Trump and his lackeys and his administration ignored all these details. The advantage of having an administration made up of only sycophants is that none of them are likely competent to assess the different scenarios that could occur, especially scenarios about revenues from tariffs in the event our naked emperor...
Please.
Oh, God,
no.
did I really... I can't get that out of my head now.
Absolutely.
Well, in the event that he doesn't get his way about tariffs, some which have already been paused by the district court, which has ruled they are unconstitutional. Now, what is this unconstitutional business? The Congress reserves the right to impose, alter, or remove tariffs to the legislative branch, namely Congress. So these tariffs violate the separation of powers. It is good for Trump that the Republican majorities in both houses consist of spineless toadies seeking his approval so they don't have to face a nut job in their primaries. So, it could be the case that the federal courts could throw out all these tariffs. It was illegal for Trump to impose them. He did them under the guise of a national emergency.
Exactly.
But in fact, they've been put in place illegally, and unless Congress codifies them, in other words, votes to pass them as laws, which is how you make tariffs, the revenues don't count in the federal budget.
Well, I've understood that. I've also understood that if they are found to be illegal, they have to give the money back, which strikes me as somewhat hilarious. But
yes, but who do they give the money back to? In other words, you and I will have already paid the higher prices.
Right.
So who are they going to give it back to?
Well, exactly. So it's an unprecedented confusion. But let's say the courts decide, I think you've touched on this, what you did was executive overreach. It's illegal. This business of a national emergency does not apply in this case. So they have to now go to the Congress to approve the tariffs. But Congress now is held by narrow margins, the Republicans. So would they validate, or would there be long ongoing debates about adjusting the tariffs? What do you think will happen?
Well, not everybody in Congress, even the Republicans, are in favor of these tariffs. And with midterm elections coming forward, you might see some Republicans break with the president on the issue of tariffs. That's more likely in the Senate, though, than it is in the House, because most of the senators will outlast Trump. They, so they don't have to be terribly concerned about revenge in this particular case. But we haven't seen any backbone from the Republican Party on anything with regard to the president's overreach. They seem just to be going along with this. I suppose they could probably pass it in the House pretty rapidly. I think they would get a filibuster in the Senate.
Well, yeah, and I'm also thinking that by the time the courts decide, the tariffs will have taken effect, and people who are going to be negatively affected by them will be aroused and putting pressure on their elected officials.
One would hope. And of course, the notion of a refund is hilarious because you and I and small businesses all pay those ultimately, but they're initially paid by the brokers and importers who brought the goods over in the first place. This is like just giving them a bonus, you know.
Yeah,
They've passed those costs on and recovered them, but you're going to give it back to them again. So it's like the U.S. citizen gets screwed twice by Trump's tariffs. Here's the other problem about codification, though. Once they're codified, it takes an act of Congress to change them. And Trump is changing these every single day.
That's the other thing I was going to ask about is even at the best, the projections assume consistency, which you just said in your beautiful Latin. But there is no consistency here.
No, there's not. And of course, the head of the Congressional Budget Office did throw in that wonderful term, uncertainty.
Yeah.
If you put a tariff in place and you leave it there for 15 years, you can make projections about it. If you leave it there for a whole year, you can make projections about it. Keep in mind, we're 7 months into this clown show. And, you know, last week we just imposed more tariffs on India.
Yeah.
For political purposes. I can't see Congress agreeing to all that, and they cannot cede their power once they put this into legislative form. In other words, once they lock these into legislation, Trump can't change them.
Right.
So, you know, that could be a game changer if this case holds. And there's no reason to think that this will be overturned. It's really going to be a function of law.
Well, I agree. Although everything I've learned about tariffs historically indicate that it is correct that the president has overreached his authority. But then I don't sit on any courts. But if that happens, let's say it happens, wouldn't the nations that Trump has made his deals with immediately act to have all of those deals renegotiated?
Absolutely.
So chaos or uncertainty.
More chaos and more uncertainty. Yeah. Well, as I said, I think in our first program, I was never a really big fan of the neoliberal economic order. I didn't believe it could be crushed in 100 days, but we managed to do that. And now nobody knows what's coming next. Either way, he can keep changing tariffs daily for the next 4 years and keep the chaos going, or this can be overturned and all of these agreements go back into flux.
Right.
And all these things have to be renegotiated with these countries. As we've mentioned several times, a real trade agreement takes years to negotiate.
Yes, and that's part of what was in the back of my mind about Congress. They're going to start hearing from people who, among other things, will be asking for exemptions for their businesses.
Of course.
I mean, that's the first thing you do. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is some businesses will be recognizing or realizing a competitive advantage. So they're raising prices because they know the competitors are affected by these tariffs. Well, they're not going to want to have to go back to their previous prices.
That's right. The purpose of tariffs is not generally to raise money for the federal government. It is to make it possible for domestic industries to compete with their foreign competitors. So once you put a tariff in and force up the price of your foreign competitors, the way that's good for you is you raise your price to just below what they're paying.
Exactly.
All right? And that means that the prices of the domestic firms should go up. Now, somebody mentioned this to Trump, and, he started threatening companies about raising prices. And, of course, Walmart told him, look, we're raising the prices, right? You impose a tariff. This is the consequences. We have a margin we have to meet in retail, and we are going to meet that margin.
Yeah, and of course they always say our margins are very narrow to begin with. They never act as if they're making large profits at all.
Retail sales of junk does not have a high margin. All right. I mean, if you look at the sales of the items in big retail chains, there's a lot of stuff there that isn't worth very much at any level. So the margins on that stuff have to be significant in order for them to make that profitable.
So they're just moving stuff closer to the landfill. That's their function.
Yeah. When we look at our shopping malls, which are essentially empty now, except for very large retailers, why are they still there? Why is Target still doing well? Why is Walmart doing well? Why are really big retail chains? It's because they're really big. They don't have high margins, but they sell a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
And that's what covers the overhead for the brick and mortar. So they cannot absorb this tariff and continue to operate. Otherwise, their prices will go up and everybody will buy everything from Amazon. And Bezos, for his next wedding, can spend, even more billions of dollars.
Okay, so I've also heard something, and I don't know if you can shed light on it yet, that we may be heading for stagflation. Have you heard this projection?
Yes. When I was a baby economist in 1973, stagflation was actually a new term, and it was coming about as a result of the fact that we had the huge increase in prices associated with the oil embargo. And our industries were based on cheap oil. So that pushed prices up dramatically and set off a set of inflation, which was generated by higher prices because of the oil. And then workers bargained with their bosses to get more money, to pay the higher prices, which caused them to raise prices further to cover the wages. And it created what we called a wage price spiral. Now, this is typical in these sorts of circumstances where prices are going up. But at the same time, we were getting deindustrialization. In other words, the response to the oil embargo is that the oil-dependent industries, which were almost all of our industries, particularly automobiles, steel, and things like that, they had to build new factories. And they built the new factories where it was cheaper to do so. Brazil.
Mexico.
Yeah. Almost any place but the United States. And they began attacking unions with the help of the federal government.
Yes, they did.
So by 1980, prices were rising dramatically. Interest rates had already been raised to 12% by the Federal Reserve to try and calm the inflation. And this created a terrible recession. At the same time, businesses were investing abroad. We had no policy to prevent that. We had no policy to help our industries retool to work on another basis, on a lower petroleum basis, and which we would have called an industrial policy that countries like Germany and Japan did. So our industries all moved abroad where there was cheap labor and cheap resources, and that's why most production is done outside the United States now, even by U.S. companies.
So would you agree that we might be facing stagflation rather than a recession?
Well, stagflation is a recession. It's simultaneously falling employment with rising prices. Those are two things that usually don't go together.
Right.
Usually during a recession, you have at least steady prices or price deflation. If you get price deflation and that leads to debt deflation, you end up in a depression.
Oh, well, we didn't want to hear that word today.
We never want to hear that word. We don't even use it when we're in one now.
I noticed that.
Yeah.
So what we're looking at is an array of economic possibilities, none of which are good.
Under the current policies and the continuation of madcap changes on a daily basis, things are not looking good.
Okay, well, there's a happy note for us to end on.
So, what did you find out this week in your exploration of Governor Newsom, who is replacing Saturday Night Live as our source of humor on a daily basis?
Isn't it true?
Yeah.
Well, we've been all entertained by his parodies of Trump, and he's been flooding the social media and becoming the focus of commentators on cable news, both the left and the right. His staff has produced visual memes of Newsom as a steroid-stoked muscle man carrying an American flag, of his face sculpted on Mount Rushmore, and of the evangelical Newsom, head bowed, being prayed over by Hulk Hogan, who's wearing wings and a halo, Tucker Carlson, and Kid Rock. He's also opened a merchandise page to parody Trump's shameless merch, including a red cap that says Newsom was right and a Bible marked sold out, which so far is my favorite. And please note, because of this, I'm considering selling red caps with the motto, "Your mother was right." Newsom has also taken to X to parody Trump's all-cap style with messages such as, "Trump just fled the podium with Putin. No questions, nothing. Total low energy. The man looked like he'd just eaten 3 buckets of KFC with Vlad. Is he afraid Vlad will ask about me? 3 question marks. America's favorite governor and the fact I stole the cameras this week with the maps."
Well, have the commentators on Fox ignored this, or do they think it needs a vigorous clap back?
Oh, they thought it needed a vigorous clapback. Every program on Fox commented on this. But their responses have been hilariously obtuse. Hannity criticized Newsom for, quote, pretending to be Trump. Trace Gallagher described Newsom's social media posts as childish and unbecoming of a leader, pointing out that as the governor of California, Newsom should be acting with more gravitas. Tommy Lahren called Newsom's tactics a new low and was shocked that he mocked political opponents with mocking nicknames. Dana Perino lamented, "I don't know where his wife is. If I were his wife, I would say, 'You are making a fool of yourself. Stop it.'"
Okay, now, were they kidding?
Oh no. Of these tone-deaf responses, Nicole Wallace, the MSNBC commentator, said, "Hypocrisy is dying a sad and painful death right now." Outright hypocrisy, I think, barely scratches the surface of the Fox response. For its effectiveness, it demonstrates the heavy reliance on goldfish punditry.
Okay. There's always a danger in making up expressions in this. What does this mean?
Okay, this is a new one. It's a term coined by Charlie Sykes to describe how commentators want their audiences to forget very recent history. In case you haven't heard of him, and I'm not a follower, Sykes was a call-in radio conservative, but became disgusted with the Trump Republicans in 2016. He turned to online platforms, including Bulwark, which he formerly edited, and he can now be found on a Substack outlet called To the Contrary. He's also a guest commentator on left-leaning cable news and podcasts. He coined the term goldfish punditry from a line in the wonderful series Ted Lasso. You know what the happiest animal on earth is? It's a goldfish. You know why? Got a 10-second memory. Now, before we go further, I have to add there's a disagreement among scientists who study fish cognition, and I did not make up that name, fish cognition. I hope that I'm not sounding flippant. See what I did there? About how much memory a goldfish has. Evidently, they can remember some things for several weeks, but I digress. The point is
that was a really clever interlude there to bring up an issue I know is coming.
The point is that the Fox News commentators' responses lean heavily on their trust that their audience will have some kind of amnesia, which will not allow them to notice that Newsom is engaging in parody. One commentator tried to dismiss it by saying imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. Well, parody is not imitation. Given the median age of their viewers, and speaking for my own aging memory, it might be a reasonable assumption that they'll just forget that Trump has done every one of these things.
So how have the Democrats responded?
You're going to be shocked that Democrats are divided on this.
Looking a gift horse in the mouth.
Yeah, huh? Well, true. David Axelrod, who was a political consultant for Barack Obama, is a little skeptical. A recent Vanity Fair article quoted him as saying, quote, "As you know, a lot of Democrats have been deeply frustrated by what they see as a weak and feckless response to Trump's bellicosity and audacious power grabs. The redistricting battle has given Newsom a tangible platform, a way to do something, and he believes that the gleeful trolling will give some primal satisfaction to a base tired of Trump's unremitting nastiness. But the question is, come 28, will people be looking for an alternative to that, or a guy who can match Trump cheeky post for cheeky post?" Close quote. On the other hand, Representative Eric Swalwell, Democrat of California, is highly enthusiastic about Newsom's approach. In answer to a question from Nicole Wallace about why it has taken 11 years for a Democrat to mock Trump, Swalwell said essentially it was because Democrats always want to claim the moral high ground. He is tired of being told, when they go low, we go high. In addition to these sources, Ken Martin, the DNC chair, and Democratic political consultants Jamal Simmons and Stephen Smith see Newsom's style as invigorating, while other Democrats and donors are cautious about his political positions.
So what is the way forward here? Is Newsom paving the way for Democratic success, or by engaging in this mocking behavior, is he further degrading the political discourse?
Well, I wish to announce to our loyal listener that in addition to being a media maven, I'm also a PhD in English literature. And I am here to say that across the political spectrum, there is a serious failure to understand how irony works. This probably has to do with the decline in enrollments in the humanities, but I'll leave that for another day. The Democrats' hesitation about utilizing either irony or wit, and parody is an example of both, indicates that they are stuck in provincial confusion about maintaining the moral high ground, with a middle-class fear of committing a social impropriety. This goes back to Swalwell saying that he's tired of hearing, when they go low, we go high. The Democrats need to realize that using irony and wit is not the same as being rude or crude or, God forbid, déclassé. It is not the same as going low.
So where should Democrats look for examples of how to maintain the moral high ground while deploying ironic barbs?
All those who oppose Trump, in my humble opinion, should look to our former colonial oppressors. Irony and wit are baked into the British political discourse. The Daily Star, not a notably liberal newspaper in the UK, some listeners will remember, set up a live stream of a head of iceberg lettuce with a digital clock and a portrait of then Prime Minister Liz Truss with the question, which will last longer? It went viral. Liz Truss was Prime Minister for 45 days, only slightly longer than a goldfish's memory. The popular BBC political quiz, Have I Got News for You, regularly skewers politicians, some of whom are guests on the show. In 1990, the producers repeatedly invited Home Secretary Roy Hattersley of the Labour Party to be a guest, and on 3 occasions he canceled at the last minute. After the 3rd time, the show's staff placed a tub of lard in the guest chair. It was introduced as having, quote, roughly the same consistency and capacity for rational thought, close quote, as Hattersley. It became and still is a running joke, and you can find it on YouTube. Hattersley acknowledged the joke, saying he wasn't thrilled about being lampooned, but recognized it as part of the culture of British political satire. He also quipped that he had been, quote, replaced by something more interesting, close quote. Ultimately, he did come as a guest on the program. In 2016, Nikki Morgan, a conservative, canceled at the last minute and was replaced by a designer handbag. She had publicly questioned Prime Minister Theresa May's 995-pound leather trousers, and I don't mean that's how much she weighed. I mean that's how much it cost. Soon after, the public learned that Morgan carried an expensive handbag with a price tag of 950 pounds. Jeremy Paxson, a hard-hitting journalist on British Channel 4 News, often uses wit and verbal irony to put pressure on politicians who, for some reason, continue to submit to his interview style. And anyone who has watched Prime Minister's Question Time when the PM appears every Wednesday in Parliament to submit to questions and criticism will know that a politician without a modicum of wit will not last long.
Having experienced the tub of lard experience in a philosophical debate, I now have a better understanding of what we were arguing about.
Did somebody mention this to you?
Yes.
When was that?
In my research group, when we were talking about social positioning, it was their example of anything can be positioned as anything. Even a tub of lard on a TV show. Going, where the hell did I get that?
So this study group was in the UK, right?
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
Cambridge, yeah.
Well, CNN is renewing the American version of Have I Got News for You for a 3rd season. Isn't that a sign that political satire can work in the U.S.?
Well, yes, but that isn't entirely my point. After all, late-night programs and stand-up comedians have shown the popularity of political satire. The outrage when Stephen Colbert was canceled is evidence of that. No, what I want to consider are the uses by politicians of irony and its subsets of parody and wit. It is possible to deploy irony for humorous purposes while being a political leader who engages in serious issues that are responsive to public needs. Newsom reflects that possibility, and it is sadly quite telling how many pundits and politicians are surprised at it. The function of irony is to juxtapose how things ought to be with how things are. The argument can and has been made that irony is a powerful tool for social bonding because it requires an audience that can perceive the distance when it is pointed out with verbal dexterity. Reacting to irony or a witticism reveals that we identify with others who react the same way. The argument is therefore also made that can be a tool for creating or enhancing social divisions because its effect reinforces a sense of those who are insiders and those who are outsiders.
Okay, so how can political irony be used to promote political consciousness without further degrading public discourse?
Well, there's a profound understanding of irony and its uses, both at the societal level and in terms of individual consciousness. Soren Kierkegaard, in on the concept of irony, which was his dissertation in 1841, described one kind of irony as, quote, a stimulus for thought that quickens it when it becomes drowsy, disciplines it when it becomes dissolute, close quote. Now, we're living in the digital age, and attention has been commodified. The attention economy is scarcely counterbalanced, I would argue, by the 54% of Americans who read at least one book a year, and that percentage is in decline. Americans swim in a soup of fragmented images and bytes of information provided by the internet, while algorithms feed on divisiveness and emotional arousal. This has been exploited by politicians who understand how to mobilize it, and that is particularly Trump and his acolytes. The fear of committing a social impropriety has bedeviled Democrats who have no idea how to stake out the moral high ground while using visual and verbal irony to create messages that go viral. That is, until now.
This is great if they learn from what Newsom is doing effectively, but can they move beyond parody to other kinds of irony?
Well, yes, if they get some skilled staffers, they can. One kind of irony is situational irony, and it points a moral lesson because the truth contradicts the expected outcome. The myth of the tortoise winning the race against the hare is an example. Will politicians who oppose Trump effectively utilize the power of irony to mobilize Americans when we are awash in the coming economic tsunami? I don't know, but they sure should. Verbal irony is when the meaning is opposite to and undermines what someone else has said. When Trump deployed the National Guard and armed them in Washington, D.C. with the excuse that he wanted to fight crime, there should have been a spate of scathing ironic comments pointing out his total inaction when a mob stormed Congress, his evident encouragement of them, his delay in calling out the National Guard, and his pardoning of those jailed for participating. Ditto when FBI agents raided Bolton's home looking for secret government documents. The nation, and I don't mean simply saying, oh, that's a terrible thing to do. I mean deploying the tools of irony available in our very rich language. The nation desperately needs politicians with the skill and gumption to quicken and discipline thought by using ironic juxtaposition. Above all, political irony used to comedic effect can jolt individuals out of the bubble of assuming that how they perceive reality is how everyone else does. And isn't an antidote to solipsism what we most need now? People are just talking to other people who agree with them. As Kierkegaard also said, irony is the birth pangs of the objective mind. In other words, ironic statements that are comedic can make you rethink what you thought everybody else was thinking. I would quote more of him, but ironically, I cannot understand much of what he says about irony.
Some of the themes you came upon where the irony should have been used, for our listeners who are goldfish, you might want to remind them of why the National Guard being called up by Trump is ironic. Juxtapose that irony a little clearer.
Well, because he didn't. He sat there watching an insurrection, an attack on Congress that injured people who were trying to defend Congress, that threatened the lives of elected officials. And, as the person in the Democratic Party most concerned about not committing an impropriety, right? I say Nancy Pelosi. Her favorite thing to reference is that they left poo-poo on her desk. And he sat there and watched it. He watched it happen, and people were screaming for him to call in the National Guard from Maryland. And he delayed for most of the day. Mm-hmm. So for him to now say, oh, Washington, D.C. is a sink of crime, we have to put a stop to this.
Do you think Trump is even capable of seeing the irony in his statements?
No, I think he thinks it's tit for tat, that everything is corrupt. Nothing is ever done out of principle or out of a sense of law. And he thinks like a gangster, that if they came after him, then he's going to go after them because they're bad people. They're corrupt. They're acting out of bad motives. And he wanted not to leave the White House. And I think he thinks the election was stolen. No matter how many people have told him no, this guy doesn't have all of his marbles rolling in the same direction.
I think that this, in some ways, clarifies why his speech patterns are so fragmented. He's just moving from whatever flashes in his mind. You know, I would like to think that he was like a mob boss in organized crime, but I've always been fond of organized crime as opposed to disorganized crime. and I think what we're seeing here is chaotic crime. I mean, his attention span seems to be that of a
there's something wrong, obviously, at the cognitive level with him as well as at the moral level.
Wow.
All right, well, now let's turn to some things you've been thinking about before I turn to what I went on to think about after last week's show. So you're going to give us some tidbits of corruption and other spectacles to distract the public from what is actually happening. It's a short headline, but go ahead.
Yeah. Last week we talked about Trump's attack on Lisa Cook, and he topped this off. Trump fired Federal Reserve Board member Lisa Cook for cause, the cause being an issue unrelated and predating her work at the Fed. Trump's lickspittles are starting an investigation. The Fed says it will abide by court rulings, not Trump's declaration. There have yet to be any charges or indictments, and it is unlikely there will be if the Justice Department isn't thoroughly politicized and corrupt. The financial markets have widely seen the attempt to fire Lisa Cook as being just another attempt by Trump to undermine the independence of the Federal Reserve Bank. All of this activity pushed the yield on 30-year Treasury bonds to a near record level in relation to the yield on short-term U.S. Treasury bonds. This increase in long-term bond yields suggests that the market participants believe interest rates will remain stable in the short term. Still, inflationary policies will ultimately lead to higher interest rates in the long term. Hence, it is time to prepare for a recession. Or if you look closely at recent photos of Trump, possibly the zombie apocalypse.
Okay, so now you've been looking at idiotic and unconstitutional criminalization of flag burning as an incitement to riot.
Yeah, to kill a news cycle this week, Trump made another idiotic spectacle to deflect the media from the disasters his policies are creating. He signed an executive order banning flag burning and imposing a 1-year prison sentence for doing so. Now, the Supreme Court decided years ago that burning flags is political speech and thus protected by the First Amendment. He said the burning of flags could not be protected speech because they were an incitement to riot. The irony lost on this idiot and the media about this argument came from a man who on January 6th gave a protected political speech that caused a riot that turned into an insurrection aimed at achieving a coup.
Yes, that's what I mean by verbal dexterity. Somebody needs to, as a culture, we need to deploy wit and irony more effectively. Does he know that when he signs an executive order, it doesn't necessarily go into law?
I don't think so. But the interesting thing is he has signed a lot of illegal executive orders, and then the executive branch has begun to act as if those executive orders were proper and appropriate, and gone out and arrested people and
Right.
rounded up people and put them in detention centers and all these sorts of things, which are later found out to be totally illegal. In fact, Alligator Alcatraz, the people who have been sent there are going to be released. So his view, or at least his expectation, is it's legal until it's stopped.
What about this threat of sending the National Guard to, and I'm going to use the word invade, Chicago and Baltimore?
Well, apparently his belief is that his invasion of the District of Columbia has been successful. And we know that it has had little impact on crime, but increased the effectiveness of ICE rounding up people with brown skin in the D.C. Quite a lot. So, it adds to the sort of martial law Gestapo actions in the D.C. intended to, intimidate everybody there. And this is transparent. The governor of Illinois says they will not come into Chicago, and since the governor generally is the one who calls up the National Guard, he's got a pretty good case of saying they can't do it. One has to ask the question, why Chicago and Baltimore, and not some of the places where crime is really quite high? For example, I think one of the Congress people from Arkansas said that the crime rate in the capital of Arkansas is considerably higher than any of these cities, so that their governor is actually safer when he's in D.C. than when he's walking out his front door.
So now Trump also attacked something that most people don't know about, which is the U.S. Senate's 107-year-old blue slip policy.
Yeah, I guess this requires a little explanation. When the president nominates someone to a federal court, which requires Senate approval, either senator or both from the state where the judge will serve can, quote, blue card the nominee. By virtue of this action, the nomination is rejected. Trump's tantrum was the result of two senators in New Jersey both blue carding the nomination of one of Trump's typically unqualified, inexperienced toadies to the position. The senators are both Democrats. The Republican Senate Majority Leader, John Thune, has responded that the Senate will not give up the practice. Now, there's a reason that this is in place. The rationale for this practice is to avoid appointing an individual whose perspective on matters that come before this court is radically out of alignment with the views of the people in the district. Okay? We see all their high-profile decisions involving policy and stopping Trump or allowing Trump to do things. That's not the day-to-day business of these district courts, okay?
Right.
They handle federal lawsuits. They handle federal criminal cases. These are local matters, and they are treated in fairly straightforward ways most of the time, unless you have a conflict between the community. If you ignore either senator's concerns, and all senators, of course, have concerns about these appointments, it is unlikely that person could make it through the confirmation process. That is why many lawsuits that result in crazy rulings during the Biden administration originated in a district court in Texas, where the Republicans were able to install a right-wing ideologue who would dependably rule that everything Biden did, including walking up and down stairs, having a hamburger, was unconstitutional. This judge's silence during this presidency is not ironic.
I understand.
Okay. Of course, this policy has frustrated all the president's nominations since its inception. The senators all know that the president from their party will have many nominees rejected in this way, but it is balanced out when a president from the other party makes nominations. this does seem kind of anti-democratic, that one senator can block a nomination to a federal district court. But these district courts are all over the country making thousands of decisions, rulings in hundreds of cases, and this allows people from one party to often stop a nomination inconsistent with their views on the extreme side. Most judges get nominated and go through the process seamlessly. It is only when there is a really strong conflict over this that they are rejected. So what this tends to do is moderate the entire judiciary, the federal judiciary, at this level, at the district court level. Okay, so that means you get a more homogeneous group of judges over the spectrum in the country. Yeah, you got this guy in Texas who will rule against any presidential action by any Democratic president. He's going to be a pain and a thorn in the side of every Democratic president in the future. So I think he's going to have a long, miserable life. But the fact of the matter is, the question is, why are the Republicans filing these national lawsuits in Texas? And this has come up as an issue already to be thought of. So this is part of Trump's revenge tour. He was trying to impose one of his friends and one of his former lawyers as a district judge for life in New Jersey, where that would have created a nice place for them to go.
Right. And so what else has he been throwing tantrums about?
Oh, he had a tantrum, and the media rushed to cover it rather than the news when a Trump-appointed judge threw out Trump's frivolous lawsuit against all of Maryland's federal district judges.
Right.
The judge ruled that the lawsuit was simply another attack on the courts by Trump and that there was no legal or constitutional basis for such a lawsuit. So again, this is sort of the short-term media grab. It's also just part of his revenge tour, and he doesn't care if it's legal or not.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So he's just, and it takes up time, it takes up airspace, it takes up communities' ability to concentrate on real things. Trump's brain is like a mirror of a malevolent internet. I mean, it's just junk.
Well, I wanted to answer a question you asked me last week about predictive policing. You wanted to know if any court decisions were overturned as a result of the police secretly using predictive software, such as Palantir Gotham. And the answer is evidently not. In the few cases I found, the court decided that it would not have affected the outcome were it known. But, speaking of the courts, there is disturbing research about the use of predictive algorithms in setting bail and sentencing. Dr. Hani Farid holds an endowed chair and is the head of the Chair of Computer Science at Dartmouth. He is the co-founder and CTO of 4 and 6 Technologies, an image authentication and forensics company, and a senior advisor to the Counter Extremism Project, which builds research and analysis databases on extreme groups. He became interested in learning that courts are using predictive algorithms to set bail and make decisions about sentencing. His research began with a simple question, which is, how accurate are these algorithms? And are they more objective and fair? And do they remove human bias? His research team recruited, and I love this, 400 participants from a crowdsourcing platform. Participants were given a short paragraph about the purported criminal's record. This information was derived from the records of 8,000 criminals whose records for reoffending were tracked for 2 years, so the researchers could test the accuracy of the predictions. They were also given additional information, including the age and criminal record, and 5 or 6 other factors. Participants were paid $1. The survey asked a simple question, which was whether this individual, described in the paragraph, was likely to reoffend. It took them about 10 seconds to read the paragraph and make their choice. The computerized software had an accuracy of 65%, while the randomly selected participants had an accuracy rate of 67%. Race was not included in the information provided to participants, but significantly, they made the same errors as the software. They were more likely to say that a black defendant at a rate of 37% would reoffend, compared to 27% for white defendants. The results also showed that a white defendant would not reoffend at a rate of 40% versus 29% for black defendants. So again, this is congruent with what the algorithm was showing. So the same racial biases popped up even though racial information was not provided. To find out why, Professor Farid and his research team reverse engineered the software because they couldn't obtain the software because of its proprietary restrictions. They built software with hundreds and hundreds of classifiers with all the possible subsets. They discovered that of all these factors, 2 they used in the random group of participants were enough to obtain the same level of accuracy as the commercial software: how old the offender was and the number of convictions, both as a juvenile and as an adult. In this country, the number of crimes is an index of race because black people are more likely to be arrested, particularly for minor crimes, than whites. In other words, institutional racism is baked into the criminal justice system, and companies selling the idea that their software is more accurate and hence fairer than human judgment are conning the courts.
Yeah, this is unsurprising. When you're using this large database information, what you're doing is basically reifying the past. You're taking all of the mistakes of the past and passing them forward into your software. And if you were to look at the arrest rate and look at where the police were put, you would notice something about race as well.
Yeah.
You know, it's not just that black people commit crimes. Of course they do. White people commit crimes too. But the police are put into the neighborhoods where the black people live,
Yeah.
and so the arrest rate's considerably higher. More of them get caught. But that suggests to the population that black people commit more crimes than white people, and that black people are more likely to commit crimes. And this software is making sure they continue to do that.
And you can come to that conclusion in 10 seconds for $1.
Wow.
I know.
Today, I signed a letter from the American Economic Association objecting to the firing of Lisa Cook. And that's
Excellent.
circulating. The
Excellent.
International Association for Feminist Economists is doing the same, so that the economics profession is rallying behind Lisa Cook.
No, that's excellent. I mean, I think this is so, it's just appalling the way these knuckle draggers, if there's a black woman in a position of competence and authority, they will go after her. It's just awful. Well, I hope it works. I hope the courts decide that this is nonsensical interference.
I would be very surprised if this ever went to court. I
Good.
mean, nobody's bothered to ask her why. And now, of course, she can't answer because
Yeah.
there's a criminal investigation. But, you know, nobody's even asked, well, why did you do this?
Why did you take out 2 mortgages?
Yeah. You take out a mortgage at a particular point in time with a certain intention. And if things change, you may take out another mortgage in another place because things have changed.
And you rent out the place, and because you don't want to sell it, so you rent it out and you go to the other place. Yeah. Well, there you go. It's America as we have come to know it.
Yep.
Okay. See you next week.
See you next week.